All right, so we're going to get ahead and get started. Hi, friends on Zoom. Thank you for joining us, and thanks for everyone here. Really delighted to see all of you. My name is Faria Khan. I'm the co-director of Asian American Studies, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to our conversation today with our esteemed guests. Before I introduce them, I want to just say a couple of words about the course and the fact that it's advanced registration. So please take a look at our course offerings. They are right here. I'll pass those along. We have two new courses. One of them is American Race, and then the other one is Sonic Reverberations of Asian America. We have someone, Stephanie George, that will be teaching that. She's an ethnomusicologist. I think that'll be a fantastic new course that we're excited to be able to offer. And then some core courses as well that will be happening in the spring. So please take a look, let me know if you have any questions. In addition, I want to just also pass around information about the ASA minor in case anyone is interested. It's 6 easy courses that you can take to fulfill the minor. Many of those courses fulfill the cultural diversity requirement, and we have, I think, 1 or 2 courses as well that fulfill the cross-cultural analysis requirement. So please have a look at that. And again, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer that. And Dr. Pillai is here as well. So grateful that you're here with us. Dr. Pillai is also going to be teaching 2 courses in the spring, and they are
Asian American Gender and Sexualities and the Asian Caribbean.
Great. So thank you. And lots of exciting stuff happening with Asian American Studies next semester as we begin to celebrate throughout the entire January to May our 25th anniversary, which is a huge accomplishment. And I hope that many of you will be able to join us for some of those festivities, including a really big celebration in March. So stay tuned for more information on that. So I want to talk just briefly about the course before we begin. And I want to thank all of the partners that helped bring this to fruition. The course is cross-listed with urban studies, it's cross-listed with sociology, Africana, Latin American Latino studies, and South Asia studies, as well as urban studies. So it's really wonderful to be able to partner with all of my colleagues to bring this course forward. And I'm very grateful for all of the support for the Paideia program that really helped launch this particular course. So the course is called American Race, a Philadelphia Story, and it's really thinking about 2 parts, right? One is the American race part, like what is race, how do we study race, right? And in the US, we've had lots of conversations about race. And so this course is an introductory course that introduces students to basic interdisciplinary approaches to race, right? So we'll see how sociologists think and study race, how Asian Americans consider race, right? Through various methodologies and disciplines. Okay, so that's one piece of it, right? But, you know, I felt that it wasn't enough to really just read this literature, right? And to think about the different methodologies of race. And so I'm fortunate enough to be able to also offer a consideration of what is happening in Philadelphia, right? Issues on race and racialization. And so while students will be able to have a basic understanding of race, I want to begin to complicate that with lived experiences of what is happening in Philadelphia. And Philadelphia is our home, right? This is where most of us live and many of us work, right? And so I don't want us to just sit in this lovely room and think about race and how it's happening to other people, but I want us to see and hear from experts that are actually dealing with these situations, right? And so our city. And so I hope that it encourages students to become involved, right? And because they'll see people that are leaders in our city engaging in this, as well as incredible academics from our youth as well. So those are the two pieces of the course. And this particular panel is to just offer one little taste of what the course would be like. And I'm so thrilled to welcome my esteemed colleagues. And I'll just introduce them very, very briefly, and then I'll let them talk a little bit about themselves and the work that they're doing. And you'll see that, we'll think about what is our link together and how can we move some of this conversation forward, right? And so maybe I'll begin with Dr. Brian Peterson, who's the director of MAKUU.
So when you ask the question, what do we do? It's a hard question because I really have to think about what do I do? Like, I do so many different things. I would say first and foremost and fundamental to this conversation is I'm a parent of 5 children, all of which have gone to the public schools. My daughter now, she's the oldest and she's here, she's a sophomore. So I also do student advising, not just for her, but for all Penn undergraduate students, whoever happens to find the MAKUU space. MAKUU being a Black Cultural Center, we typically see Black students, but because I teach courses here, I get students from all over who are interested in education, interested in urban studies. I don't know how I found my way into teaching financial literacy, but that's happened. I mean, the short story is a alumni friend of mine who actually plays NFL football. He brought this idea to us to teach financial literacy to college students because he was realizing he needed this stuff till he got to the league. So long story short, we've been teaching this class for the year 4 or 5 this year, and I taught a version of it myself, focusing on selling equities. So that's been happening. I'm also on a board, I'm on a couple of different boards who are doing education work. One is Lion Story, which is works with Howard Stevenson on racial literacy. So yeah, so there's a lot of layers that as we talk further, I'm happy to just go in on like what some of the core issues are, what some of the things are on my mind.
Great, thank you so much. And for those of you that don't know, MAKUU is located in the Arch Building, which is at 36 and Locust Walk. Great, thank you so much. Let me introduce Shanell Ransom, who's an program officer at the Fels Foundation, Fels Fund. And I have to say this, Shanell was recently highlighted as one of the 45 Philadelphians that's making a big impact in our city. And so thrilled to congratulations and thrilled to welcome you to campus.
Hi everyone, Shanell, she, her pronouns. I've been in Philadelphia a little over 6 years, and I feel like I've lived here much, much longer because of my job at the Fels Fund, but also the many ways that I've been able to volunteer with a church in West Philly, with the Philadelphia Black Giving Circle, sitting on various boards and advisory committees, but also race growing up in the South is something that I always saw, and it always happened to me, being in a lot of white spaces. So growing up, I carried this like, what is actually happening here and what can be done, and realizing various principles of tokenism and privilege and power and how things are clashing. And also how things are working / not working in various systems, but in philanthropy in particular, how are we redistributing resources to communities that haven't had access, to communities that resources have been extracted systematically? And what does it mean to kind of have your own sense of agency, to talk about your community, to talk about the issues, and create change and bring people along and educate others. So philanthropy has been that space that I've been able to do all of those things and challenge myself. and challenge my own assumptions, and unlearn bad habits as well. But race plays a very big part in a lot of the work that is being done in philanthropy as a whole. And in 2020, it kind of boiled to the top with the what happened with COVID in the city, with the civil uprisings in the city, with activists being arrested in their homes. Just so many things that we may see on the news and think, wow, that's terrible. But it's really happening to people like me, like you, and it's a very real thing. And in my position, I'm able to actually do something.
So great. And Shanell, we'll look forward to maybe you could talk a little bit about specific organizations that you've worked with as well. And welcome to Stephanie Sun, who's the Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Governor's Advisory Commission on Asian Pacific American.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I'll take over. As you heard, our commission has a very long name. The full name is Pennsylvania Governor's Advisory Commission on Asian Pacific American Affairs. And now my daytime job is to serve as the executive director for this commission. And my name is Stephanie Sun. Very nice to meet you, everyone. I am an immigrant, born and raised in China, and worked in South Korea for several years before I came to this country. And Philadelphia is the first stop that I chose when I went to this country. Then I just stay here. So now I regard this city as my home, and so many beautiful people, wonderful people I have met here, and many story happened in my career path and also in my life. So so as I said that I used to, so far I live, work, study, and teach in 3 countries: China, South Korea, and US. And fortunately, because I always like to explore and experience a different way of life. So I feel I'm very, fortunate to have the experience to also work in both in government in 3 countries, also in private sector, for example, Fortune 100 corporation in those 3 countries. So everything happened and made who I am today. And also I feel very grateful to be able to serve on this position, because it's just combine all the opportunity and give me the opportunity to work on all my passion. Like even when I work in the government or nonprofit or company, I always serve on boards, always do volunteer work, always try to help with and be with grassroots community. So that all come together in my current job, because my current job is to, for our community, to advocate and serve the Asian Pacific American community. So the commission can be seen as a government agency, but also the bridge and the co-liaison of this diverse community to make sure the Commonwealth government is accessible and also accountable for the community. And we're very lucky to have Dr. Khan to be one of our former commissioners. So she organized several very important town halls in UPenn to engage the UPenn community and also local community to address the concerns of our community. So thank you so much for having me here. I'm sorry about that.
No, I'm sorry. I'm okay. Just went down the wrong pipe, but thank you. And I think the town halls, they were an opportunity for, after maybe the first opportunity, where community members were actually welcome to campus and were allowed to share their thoughts. It was also the very first one that we had was the day after the election in 2017. And that was a really painful moment for many members of the community to come together and actually be able to share was really important for that. So I want to turn to thinking about your work and race and thoughts on education. Whether it's on Penn's campus or in the city, how are we doing?
Well, the big lawsuit starts tomorrow. So Education Law Center is one of the legal partners and suing the state for inadequate funding of public schools. But a lot of those stories that are highlighted in the case are of people of color. And thinking about the city of Philadelphia, you said you had children that go to district schools. The schools are widely different from staffing to quality of the buildings to who gets served in terms of special education or IEPs that students may have and how those things are carried out. The Fels Fund just funded a parent organizing group that's focusing on Black parents and elevating their voices to concerned parents that are being told you're a threat because of their Black skin and their elevated voice, and then they're not able to advocate for their child in a public school that they pay taxes for, that they have a right to go to. So thinking about the bias that is there and thinking about how funding is allocated, but also who even has a right to be heard as it's dictated by the district or the school.
And Shanell, what's the name of that organization again, just so that we all know?
It's Philly Parent Organizing Project. The name may be tweaked a little bit in the upcoming year, but they're led by a Black woman that has worked with Helen Gim doing education policy and organizing, that has worked at Children's First, which is formerly Public Citizens for Children and Youth. They had a name change. So, and also has Children herself, a product of the Philadelphia public schools. So someone that is from here, that has seen the issues for many years and interacting with the system, and now having knowledge and access to networks and to people with power to say, okay, I want to share my skills. How can we bring some demands to the table to get some things moving in the right direction so our children can be educated, and not just my children, but the children of the district.
And that's a fairly young organization, isn't it?
Yes, so the organization is almost a year old.
Okay, that's what I remember. Yeah. I wanted to say full disclosure that I'm on the board for the Fels Fund. So, and so grateful that Shanell could be here too. Yeah, I remember that was a very young organization. Yeah, fantastic. Doing really good work.
In a way that philanthropy can take risk, because a lot of times our society is risk adverse, or it's like, oh, I think you may have the solutions, but figure it out without our money. When you figure it out, then come back to us. So that's also the beauty of this position, to be able to see the various things and have a racial analysis of what's happening in our city, whose voices are being told in the Inquirer, in Philly Mag, in various outlets, and how can we kind of elevate to push things forward. And to be clear, I'm not doing the work. I am helping to get money to those that are doing the work.
And I don't know if, before we move on, I just wondered if any of the three of you know the percentage of the city that are people of color. I think we have a percentage for African Americans.
African American.
I was thinking too, because I know the African American percentage, but the people of color percentage is answering the question.
Yeah. Because I think it's a fairly sizable portion of the city, actually.
It's more than that.
It's more than that. Yeah. So Brian, what about on campus?
So I was actually thinking, I want to talk about on campus, but I want to speak to having emerged from my home, right, with my kids all last year. I mean, I think the K through 12 question is also really interesting in terms of equity and experience, because post-COVID, so there was a digital divide, and now everybody has a Chromebook, right? And now they're still using those Chromebooks, but they're also in person. So I think there's a lot, of access questions that we've kind of answered, although the quality of digital technology is still up in the air. activity, right? So can you do the work? And I would say on campus, so it's interesting. So I teach a class on Penn's Black History. And when I was here as an undergrad in the 80s, we were sort of in this middle space of finally wrapping around Black students, right? And I would name it as Black students because the Latinx population was minimal. And there was no language around first gen. That's a new phenomenon.
That's a very, how old, I mean, that's a very recent phenomenon.
It's really within the last decade. I think
Okay.
there have been, in terms of named programs and named initiatives, if you think about financial aid policies, Stanford, Penn, that's all roughly 10 years old. But even with the financial aid policies, that's one hurdle. Then you have to say, well, once you're on campus, what are we doing to wrap around you? So again, for Black students in the 80s, this was starting to happen with tutoring. So you can look at data points to look at, again, Penn is already an anomaly, right? It's not representative of everything, but the fact that these were the numbers is telling. The Black graduation rates were like 60, 70%, right? Now everybody's like 90%. So, again, there's work to be done, but I think, again, looking at the Penn context, which I'm most familiar with, even with high graduation rates for Black students and Latinx students, there can still be this, which job can I get? Am I competitive to get an investment banking job, or am I going to get the marketing job? If you wanted to get the marketing job, that's great. But if you tested out of the marketing, out of the investment banking job, then now there was something else that we didn't do for you. If you wanted to go to medical school, but now you're in education as a chemistry teacher, if you wanted to be a chemistry teacher, that's great. But if it was some sort of, we did not do what we were supposed to do to prepare you to do this thing, now we've got to ask ourselves, and that's faculty diversity, that's pipeline programs, that's all these things. Again, I'm speaking about Penn, right? So we could, run that, talk about all the other programs. And then there are programs in schools that are doing it really, really well, like My Own Scholars, Xavier, like they're prepping kids to do these rigorous STEM things in a way that we need to be looking at and figuring out how to do that. And sometimes we get in our own way because we're saying, oh no, we're fine. We're not fine.
Mhm.
We're not fine. We're doing well, but we could be doing better.
And so do you think, is the graduation rate that you're talking about, is that 4 years?
That's in 6 years. That's after
Six.
success. If you have a leave, if you have a gap, whatever the case. And again, that like with this last 18 months, that's different, right? But this isn't a normal cycle. You measure in 6 years.
And Stephanie?
Yeah, and since my work is to serve and advocate for the Asian Pacific American community, so I would like to talk about this community, starting with sharing some quick facts. Asian Pacific American community is the only community with majority of the community member are immigrants. More than 2/3 of Asian American are foreign born, and more than 1/6 of Pacific Islanders are foreign born. And also, if we look at the past 40 years, after 1965, the Immigration Act issued. Then after that, we have the peak time of the immigrant from Asia. And in the recent several decades, more than 40% of the immigrant arrivals in this country are from Asia. And now we're here in UPenn, and in this country, more than 60% of the of international students are also from Asia. So this all come together, tell us one fact that one of the most challenging, or barriers for this community is language barrier. And also think about the language barrier. When we look at the Latino community, maybe Spanish and Portuguese can cover majority of the community member. When we look at the African American community, maybe French and some other language can cover a majority. But when we look at the Asian Pacific American community, there's no one single language can cover more than like 2 countries of origin. It's so diverse. And also in Pennsylvania, more than 70 9% of Asian Pacific Americans speaking another language than English at home. So this tells us something. And the language barrier impacts students. We have, even before the pandemic, we heard so many heartbreaking stories that immigrant family students, their first several years sitting in the classroom, they don't understand what one single sentence, what the teachers taught on the stage. And they have no language tools to help them to make friends. They feel so lonely, isolated. So that's why, even though we are wearing still wearing the hats, unfortunately, as a model minority, but many kids, they choose not to finish, even just drop out before they graduate from high school for that kind of reason. And also, if we look at suicide rate, is growing very fast in the youth of Asian Pacific American community. That played an issue when they feel so lonely and also being discriminated, and even cannot really have a meaningful conversation with teacher, classmates, and when they go home, they feel also isolated because their parents maybe spend like more than 14 hours just work in store or restaurant, which is very typical Asian new immigrants life. So there are also a huge gap in the community, in the family. Many immigrant parents told us that they feel so sad that their parents even don't talk to them for several years. So within this, it all come together. It's a challenge for students caused by the language barriers. And also, it also brings the challenge for the parents. When the parents with language barriers don't know what's going on happening in the school, don't have no tool to understand what is the education system in this country, which is so far, so different than in Asian country. How can they support? And they don't have the basic concepts. Oh, parents here need to be volunteer to join some activity at school. And from China, in China, we don't have that thing at all. So that's why, it adds to another layer that the students may feel less confident when their parents even cannot show up in any parent activity. So then the pandemic hit. So whenever students just starting from home, which needs a lot of support from parents and a lot of availability or capacity to do self-learning with language barriers, even with knowledge barriers. How can they handle that? So there are a lot of layers there. We can talk this for many hours. So that's why I'm so grateful that Dr. Khan organized this class in spring. I think we can have a more deep diving conversation on this.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. And I know that, there's so much diversity in the Asian American experience. And, one of the statistics that always is shocking to me is the graduation rates for some of the Asian American community members graduating from high school. Like I think for Cambodian Americans, it's very, very low. I think it may be 30% or something, very low. And you have to wonder, what are the 70% doing, right? And many of them are joining their families working just to make ends meet. And I agree with you. I think the language barrier is huge. It's interesting that you also mentioned the parent involvement. I remember when I went to school, which was 100 years ago, but parents weren't in the classroom as much. But when I had kids, I had to go in for story time. I was baking cupcakes. I was doing all of these things. Because you kind of felt bad if you weren't involved, right? You were the bad parent. But it was an exorbitant amount of time, which Brian, you may agree, come in for this, come in for that, field trips, blah, 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 blah. And so, and you're right, in, other cultures, the child goes to school and you're done. You're not having parent-teacher conferences, which also have a language issue. So it is actually very, very difficult. So I wonder, given all of this, what you all might think is the biggest challenge for our youth today. Maybe Philadelphia specific.
I would say broadly, I may be speaking from personal experience, but I think there's an access to information and experiences. So I'm thinking about the social development, right? Like our kids, everything is here, right? And so they're seeing a world, and I'm, I'm interested and also confused by whatever meta's going to be, because I'm already like, well, they're already on their phones enough, so now you're going to create another universe where they're going to plug into that. What is the goal, right? But I think they have access to information that may not be the best information. There's shows that are really kind of situating like these youthful experiences, but they're doing adult things, right? And so then you have all of that content available to them during a pandemic.
Yeah.
So they're not engaged in school, they're not going anywhere. So it's a lot. And I would say I see that on the college side. I see that in my household from my older kids, even my younger kids to a certain degree. There's like this set of expectations around like what life is supposed to be. And that's why I think that in many ways it's a moment where we have to reconceptualize what is education, right? Because I think, I don't know how I would interact with the world if I was 15 today, right? I know if things aren't moving at a particular pace, I'm not going to be engaged. As a Black man, am I going to be labeled? Am I going to be put on medication? Am I going to act out, right? Because I did the bare minimum in school, right? It's just like what needs to be done. And my household set a really, really high standard. So my bare minimum was still excellent. But I knew I didn't read the books. Like I know I wasn't reading the books. You know what I mean? Like I read some of those books as a 40-year-old man because I was like, I probably should have read this book when I was 15, but I didn't. And so to me, there's a lot. And so this is general, right? Layer poverty to that.
Yeah.
And now, I mean, that's the gun epidemic. Because if I'm living in this reality in my mind that says there's nothing for me, so I'm going to smoke every day and I'm going to just try to make money on the street, and I know someone's going to shoot me, so I'm going to have my gun so I can shoot them first. And this is life. Like this is the social construction of my life. That's where we are. So there needs to be all sorts of other things that could be connected to school, but maybe something completely different. But the school needs to be extended. It needs to be like this broad-based partnership of all sorts of amazing opportunities to get kids coding, to get kids in hospitals, to see how to do surgeries like early so they can see this is something that I can do. This is not just a TV show. Because the amount of stuff that they are exposed to that is accessible to them that's bad is far outweighing the stuff that's good in a tangible way, right? And that's sort of a generic, non-specific education thing, but I think it's all about education because we have to create new realities for our kids and things that are appealing to them.
And I think for me, I think about safety, and this idea of safety and comfort, and it means something to every person. It may mean something different. And Dr. Hardy recently said, I can't have a meaningful conversation if I'm concerned about my safety. And there's so many things happening in the world that's racialized, not racialized, poverty, like so many things on a given day. Did I eat? Did I not eat? If a child is thinking about safety, or a young adult or a college student, what does that mean for how they're learning, how they're interacting? What is the world, the messaging that they're getting about what is valuable work or what is a valid teacher or valid education, whether it's in terms of pay, in terms of respect, in terms of dignity, in terms of work hours. Like there's so many ways to nuance it. So I think about what does one need to feel safe to even be able to expand their mind to learn. Is the content triggering? Is the content racially insensitive? like I think about my own experience growing up and being called almost everything under the sun, and I was an achieving Black student in a high performing district, but no one thought I deserved to be there. And the way my teachers treated me, the way other students treated me, even though I was a varsity cheerleader, I was on the basketball team, like I was doing these things that the world told me I needed to do, but still having this experience where I didn't necessarily feel safe. So what is someone's mechanisms? And that's, to me, a barrier potentially to education, and how someone shows up, how they evolve, how they interact with their world, and who ultimately they become.
Yeah, I think safety is a big question for many of our youth.
Yeah, I definitely share that even in API community, safety also become more and more popular topic and concern, even in HNA violence. And I think for our community, we also having heard, like beside this two major concern, also it's a challenge about identity for youth. So like, as I mentioned, in this community, majority are immigrants. So the youth who are immigrant themselves, maybe they're struggling, try to be Americanized through their whole life, but still with the question, can I one day to achieve to be really become an American? And for the API youth who are born here, as well, it can be more miserable for them, like we haven't heard many youth say that, okay, I'm not white enough, and not bright enough, and also not dark enough, and not Asian enough, and also not American enough. When they face their family member who are originally from Asian country, they're being criticized. Oh, you don't speak that English, that language well. You don't understand this culture, so they're not Asian enough. When they face their friends who are here, okay, they're always to be seen or called others. So where are their places? How should they identify themselves, and what can they do to try to get feedback in terms of how others identify themselves? Because everyone living in the world like with mirrors, everyone always identify themselves with the interaction with how people also identify themselves. But even that basic question, how they want to identify themselves, becomes such a big question. And this question is so fundamental, can reflect in so many different ways. For Asian Americans who were born here, do they have to intentionally to do something extra to try to break the stereotype who people just put them on their hats to say, oh, you're Asian, so you blah blah blah. So that bring a lot of challenge. It's not just impact the mental health, but also impact everyday life, how you make your decision, how you interact with people, and also the invest of the time. Time is the most precious resource in my eyes for everyone's life. Like how many time you want to spend to learn your Asian language. Like we heard many stories that Asian parents here put a lot of time to teach their kids who were born here the Asian language, but there's always it's like sad pattern. When the kids before they go to school, they love that. They learn the Asian language and eat the Asian food and wear the Asian outfit. But once they go to the school, surrounded by non-Asian, things change. And many parents told us that the kids, once they go to school, they refuse to respond in the Asian language to their parents. When the parents speak Asian language to them, they don't respond or respond in English because they're trying to escape from that, try to be Americanized, try to be one in the unity in the campus. But we're happy to see more and more youth when they get to another level, maybe go to their college, they also realize that, oh, identity is so important because they can never be really a purely American without also with the identity as an Asian American. So it's always a question and challenge here.
Stephanie, thank you so much. And I think one of the things that really you said, I want to emphasize for the course is the impact on the everyday, right? And I really hope that through this course, you'll have an introduction to the main scholarly readings or some of the main scholarly readings, right? But that you'll also be able to have a sense of the impact of race and racialization upon the everyday for our communities in this city. And so that's one of my goals. And so thank you so much for mentioning that. So it's now all of a sudden 5:46. And while I want to monopolize the three of you, I want to also open it up to anyone that might have a question. And if you have questions, please feel free on Zoom, friends on Zoom, if you have a question to also put it in the chat or to unmute yourself.
As we do that, I just found it really fascinating being here and listening to the different perspectives. And as you were talking about identity, it really made me think about, so in MAKUU, we support Black students, and I use the word Black intentionally because the language used to be African American, and that's no longer adequate language, right? You have students who are coming from the Caribbean, you have students who are coming from different African countries. I have a Black student coming from London. Every time he says his name, Oliver, then we know it's Oliver, but he says with the accent, and I start to say it with the accent. He says it because that's how he said it, and I'm just like, I don't even have a British accent, so I don't know how to work that out. But
Well, you're honoring how he's saying it.
exactly. But it's just amazing to understand that. But that identity question, right, is the same question that my Nigerian students are saying, and to me, I've always been fascinated by, and again, it's a blunt question, but it's like, when do you become American, right? Is this sort of the second generation? And then what does that even mean? And is that what you want to be? Right? Like you thought you wanted to be, and then you become it, and it's like, And then with race, but you're still Black, right? Which I think is also a fascinating question, and I really appreciate you situating a class in Philadelphia, because there was an article that came out in the Inquirer. It was an interactive thing. It's like click on the neighborhoods and just see the segregation, right? So what you're sharing with your young people is the same thing that African immigrant communities are also sharing, but I'm just wondering if they're talking to each other. And it's the same thing that Latinx immigrant communities are sharing, but are they talking to each other? And then are we all talking to each other about the youth cultural stuff that I was talking about? Because they're all watching the same shows, they're all reading the same memes, and they're interpreting them in different ways. But I would say the more Americanized versions of them, for the students who are really getting it in that way, it means the same thing to them. But they may not be having the conversations because of these racial divides. And then those racial divides get violent for no reason. For no reason. Right? And so that it's fascinating when you sort of zoom out and say, well, this is great. It's fascinating, like hearing these different perspectives, but then you're like, so what do we actually do to bring these young people together to help them see that, I keep referring back to having engagement with the sum of us, because it's such a powerful thing to just understand that when we keep marginalizing people just because we can point to them and say, you're different. And in the Black community, we'll do it in Philadelphia in particular, around neighborhoods that we have no ownership of. We have ownership in terms of cultural practices and history. No, we don't own this house, we don't own this store, we don't own nothing. But yet, that's my block because that's where my people are, and you can't cross that line. Why? Because it's going to give you that sense of humanity. I've invested in this, and I want to protect it. Well, how do we translate that into something positive? Right? Because we understand it's a human thing. We understand that. But the way that it manifests itself is not helpful for anybody. Like, nobody wants to be responsible for this family having to bury their child. And that's where we are. For so many different reasons that we never take the time to unpack as human beings to say, let's deal with these emotions and let's have more counseling. Let's have more therapy. let's have more healing. That needs to be a part of today's school because that's where our kids are.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for sharing that. I want to say too is that, you know, I've been thinking about some of these questions, and so the class is actually, you know, if we look at a lot of the readings in the scholarship, right, we'll see that it's about the Black community and this issue, right? It's about the Asian American community and their issue. But if we look at the issues, which is what I hope we'll do in the course, then we can see these moments where, you know, the racialization has happened across the board, right? With multiple communities, maybe not at the same moment, but at different moments in the same ways, right? And so like you can look at, like, one week is, you know, education, you know, another week is healthcare, right? I want to think about gentrification, right? And think about who's losing, you know, housing, right? And so you'll see that there's so much overlap, right? In impoverished neighborhoods, right? That we keep actually in Philadelphia and specifically we keep pushing farther out. And so, you know, those moments I hope will happen where students will see these particular moments of, you know, maybe not solidarity, but, you know, synergy maybe, right? Where it's happening. So, but thank you for mentioning that. Yeah. Other questions or thoughts?
I do have a question. Sure. It's more of a comment, just kind of based on what I've heard in general, and my own experiences here at Penn specifically. So something I'm interested in is that having being an education major, like what are the experiences in the classroom, like, or even just kind of sometimes when I come to something like this, I'm in my head like, well, what's a takeaway that I can implement? Because some of these things just sound so broad that it's like I don't even know where to start. And I actually have maybe a recommendation if you wanted to kind of pass it on that I noticed that was really helpful in my own cohort, which is incredibly diverse. I would say probably maybe like 50% at least of the cohort is people of color. And so something that my director at the very, very beginning did was take the time to have like everybody, it's luckily that we were like a small cohort, but if it's like a classroom or something like that, have everybody go and pronounce their name as they would like their name to be spoken. And said specifically to some of maybe Asian students in the classroom or Asian Pacific students in the classroom that were using maybe an Americanized name instead of their given name. She said to them, you can choose this name if you would like to use it, but if you would also like us to use the name, you know, that you speak with at home, feel free, and we will all practice and turn to each other. And whether that is for Black students who might have felt like, you know what, I've never had anybody be able to pronounce my name before, or students who just came here from, you know, around the world, that was something that like really resonated with them because I felt like, oh, I'm being seen as, you know, me and my culture. And let me tell you a little bit about why, you know, my parents might pick this name for me, why it's special to me. This is why I want you to use this version of my name. And so that's like a little thing that really helped, I think, bring my cohort together. And it is something that can be done like in the classroom so that students feel like they're being seen, even if they might not feel so. Anyway, I just wanted to suggest that.
Yeah, I took notes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Questions or comments?
Thank you for sharing about your experiences and observations of what's happening around in Pillai. And it strikes me as we're talking about this, we're seeing how the way institutions and adults are really impacting and shaping the way youth are understanding, experiencing, and internalizing race. And I'm curious, are you noting any youth club movements of the youth tackling this issue instead of, you know, leaving it to the adults? Because we're very much seeing right now, like, this generation is sick and tired of the adults messing things up, right? And, you know, they were doing some
a lot. There's a lot of youth-led work via Lead, which creatively Claire is working with. They do organizing and education through Youth Lens in South Jersey, but also in Philadelphia. There's Philly, which is West Philly based, and they work with young people with gun charges or violent charges, and this idea of safety in neighborhoods and owning blocks. They have some safety precautions in place where they actually may have to go pick up young people and bring them, or send them an Uber to bring them because they can't cross a certain street. But in this house that they have, the young people are in community and they're learning about each other and directing their mutual aid of what should we be giving the community? What do you need? They have some legislation that they're working on at the state level, but it's all informed by the young people and their experiences. Youth Art Empowerment Project, which is another one that is based on the criminal justice side, but the young people are educating each other. Okay, you got arrested, you have these charges. What does this mean? Do you need an advocate? Are you talking to your public defender? But also they're giving policy recommendations. Juvenile Law Center has a group of young people that are in and or exiting the child welfare system, and they have policy recommendations, but also practice recommendations
That they wrote.
So and it's like, this is my experience and it was terrible, and here are some recommendations, and the adults are putting them in places to be heard by policymakers, by people in power, and philanthropy is funding that work, but also on the flip side of it is philanthropy, and I say people of color in philanthropy are now saying, like, don't come to us, we're going to come to you. Like, what do you think the solutions are? Who should we be funding? So talk about power and kind of flipping it on its head of getting creative in the system that you exist in to create some kind of intermediate and transformational practices, knowing that at this time you can't blow up the whole system, even though you may want to. But like, what can we do to redistribute the resources to get it to communities, to organizations, to individuals, to people that historically don't have the money to be able to have these robust programs, to then have best practices, or to have this is a solution that actually works, and here's how we're implementing it, or to have safety in terms of funding, to say, like, we don't actually need your money, thank you, but we're not jumping through these hoops, or we're not changing our programming because that doesn't work, and this does work for our community. So seeing the mobilization around that, and I actually personally have a lot more meetings with young people, and that means I'm meeting later in the afternoon. But it's great because I do want to hear from the young people that are actually doing the work, not the executive director. They're great, love them. They number one. But if someone's leading the work, I would rather talk to them to understand what they're seeing.
Isn't there also the Philly bailout?
Yep, Philly Community Bail Fund. So a group of Black organizers that work to bail people out, and every year, twice a year, they do a youth bailout as well. But they partner with Philly, they partner with YAS, YSRP, Youth Sentencing and Reentry Project. They work with juvenile lifers, and that's people that were sentenced to life as under 18, but they may be 40, 50, 60s, but they have a lot of intergenerational work and healing circles to co-create policies and practices, but also that, like, what does it mean? Like, we have Facebook now, and like, I was incarcerated in the 70s. Like, how am I acclimating to the world? But also that wisdom and that storytelling, and kind of building up to say, like, hey, you can live after being released. Like, there are options out here. So there's a lot of amazing solutions that I'm sure I don't even know half of them, but being able to hear about them and see them interact, and hear from young people.
I would just say on the higher ed side, there's a faculty member here at GSC named Nashe, and she came from University of Missouri. So really led a lot of that work and helped really convene the students who were leading that work from the Missouri protests. And, just sort of the Black Lives Matter movement, some of that is resonating on campuses. And we really just trying to take the backseat and really listen to the students and empower them here at Penn. But I would say that's been a model for the last decade. I think about Mike Brown's killing in Ferguson, which really sort of syndicated the Missouri movement. But I was called into campus that August to help with students, but they had already organized. So I was really just the adult presence in the room. They had already done the work.
Also, I'm also very proud and excited to see like there's so much like talent and power coming from the youth. I mean, the young generation in our community. We remember in Philadelphia, actually one of the first rally happened right after the Atlanta shooting was organized by a student, and they have their network across the whole East Coast in many campus. And also, just last week, I had a meeting with a very brilliant high school student, and with an Indian American girl, and she's so passionate to work for children's rights, children with disability. She has been leading a work group in UN for several years already. And 2 weeks ago, she had the testimony and speech at UN. So I'm so proud of the young kids. So I brought her to Governor Wolf to recognize and encourage her. And yeah, there are so many story and movement happen on ground that for me, I want to learn how I can be more like support to them, to empower them. Thank you for bringing up that.
Yeah, I don't know, Claire, if you wanted to add a little bit about your own. Oh,
Sorry,
yeah,
I have to add something afterwards. but
Oh,
it's
please.
been great.
Please take some food.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for the speakers. It's been wonderful hearing from you, and I definitely want to look into all of the work that you've been doing.
Great, and also please know that when the class has a guest speaker, I will open it up to the Penn community.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I'll advertise that.
Thank you.
Yeah, bye, thanks for coming. Don't forget some dinner.
Okay.
Yeah. Claire, did you want to add anything or just from your own experience?
Oh, about youth organizing? Yeah, I think there's a very rich history of it in Philadelphia. I think a lot of, at least in the Asian community, it really at least it started really growing in after 2010. It sounds really high. Yeah, I've been learning a lot about I think I actually moderated a panel last weekend for PAF and had Ania Moore graduated from Penn, Yuan Lee organizes, or he's on sabbatical, but he's the youth projects director of Viet Lead.
Graduated from Penn.
Yeah, and also Annie Fan, who's a teacher in San Francisco, only because the panel was about a school in San Francisco. And I think something that Yun said that really stuck out to me was that schools are not underfunded; they're systemically deprived of resource. And if you even take a look at the Philadelphia city budget, the way money is dispersed, ignores our schools, and sort of that systemic deprivation of students is what translates to all of these different forms of violence that we're talking about. So I've just been reflecting on that, and yeah, our youth are great. And I think I just started youth organizing, this is my second year doing it. And something that my mentors have reflected on is how before it was hard to get the youth to think about race, right? And then it was after 2016, it was oh, white supremacy is the problem. And now they're our youth are eat the rich. And they have this richer analysis of racial capitalism that I could have never had when I was 16. And even my little brother, he has an analysis of capitalism that I'm I don't know where you learned that from, but cool. That's cool. That's just things why are people flying to the moon or flying to Mars when our schools are this and stuff like that. So yeah, I think that people
underestimate your power. And it's also like the young people who maybe don't have the vocabulary to verbalize and act to resist their experiences of like structural oppression, but once they're given the tools, they can do anything because their imaginations are limitless.
Great, thank you for sharing. I just said all the words, thoughts, and most importantly, like all your action work. That was really like I don't know how to say amazing to hear. And just overall, as someone who did grow up in Philadelphia and is coming from Philadelphia, from the schools to Penn, thankfully, like that all very like definitely spoke to a lot of experiences that I know not only myself and my classmates definitely have faced now wherever they are. And like specifically, sorry, this is going into more of a question, but I was just wondering how like have you all seen in your work how COVID has kind of like changed our like expectations to like what public schools can provide for its students? As you know, we've seen like technology and like does every student have a computer? Do they have internet access? Also, especially like food provision. Like I know the district had to really work with having like food centers each week to provide that during COVID. We can't give that to students twice a day, even if it's not the best and healthiest thing in the world. But I was just wondering kind of like how has COVID kind of like changed these expectations, and especially for like facility quality. You know, it's hard to learn when asbestos is about to, I don't know, put you out of school or give you a disease that might, you know, do terrible things, or your heating's not on or your air conditioning's not there. It's very hard to learn in those conditions. So I was just wondering.
Or you don't have a water fountain.
Yeah, clean water. Just the most basic things you need to have to learn. And I was just wondering how you guys have experienced that in your work and how it's been redefined in this pandemic.
I don't know if it was redefined. I think people are more vocal and are bolder from my point of view of asking for what they need and demanding it and knowing. I think the beauty of COVID is everyone was sitting at home and in some way had a little bit more bandwidth to take in what was happening in the world and realizing that there is money, but where is the money going, or what is actually happening in the schools, or how are the teachers talking to the students? Like there's this, I guess, hyper awareness that happened in COVID, and people that organizations and those that they're serving have said like, no, we're not taking no for an answer. Like we're gonna show up, we're gonna email, we're gonna call. Like we want answers, and I appreciate that boldness. It's just unfortunate that someone has to quote unquote be bold, be radical to actually get what they deserve. So that's just one perspective from what I'm seeing.
Say, and this is not COVID specific, and I'm gonna keep it short, but it is like a radical thought. What are we doing in these school buildings? Right? So I grew up in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and like in my world in Harrisburg, I rode the yellow school bus. The school had a football field, baseball field. It was like suburban, right? I had never seen a city school. So when I get to Philadelphia and I start tutoring at the old West Philadelphia High School on 46 and Walnut, which is now a residential apartment building.
That is crazy, by the way.
Yeah.
That happened over COVID.
Yes. And now, so the new West Philadelphia High School is more like where I would, like, basically the question I always ask myself, and again, it's interesting, today I was looking at city plans that Philadelphia, that Penn put together for Market Street, building the University Science Center, and I found like a couple of other border ones, but I'm always just wondering, like, what was the plan for these buildings, right? They're not situated to do, I don't know what they were situated to do when they were built, right? It's essentially a child warehouse where, you know, you're gonna have a room bigger than this in the front and you're in these rows. We don't need to be doing that. Like we never need to be doing that. Now we definitely don't need to be doing that. But how are we not going to do do that? So how do we prioritize like green spaces around buildings that are educating kids? How do we, you said the lunch pickup, right? It's not the best food. Why are we giving kids horrible food? In any situation, COVID or not COVID. So again, it's like fundamental things where it's like, oh, efficiencies, economics, scale. No, kids, like these are my kids. So I want them to have the best. And my family's made the best out of the options that we've had. But the question I'm always wondering is at some point, like Penn is never going to build second rate stuff. So how do we get the city to say, we don't want second rate stuff with the future of our city, for the future of our world? So there needs to be like a check mark. All of the schools with specials need to go first. And then let's build something else. And let's create this space to actually build it, because we can definitely create the space to build an FMC tower, which I'm imagining is cool for somebody, but I've never been in there. I don't even know what, I mean, I know Penn development is in there. I should probably start talking about Penn. But in any event, like that's there. And it's an amazing space, I would imagine.
Well, it says kind of innovation,
Right.
which has green space.
Right.
Um,
Right. Which could be a school.
correct.
Could be a
It
school.
has actually quite a bit of green space
Yeah.
on the side of it, yeah.
Yeah, so I think you're quite, I mean, the COVID context is the same as sort of the George Floyd Breonna Taylor moment for me, and the same as sort of the Asian violence moment. Like there's these light bulbs that are shined on these things. But it's like, why were we doing this in the first place, right? Why do we hate people in the first place? Why do we have horrible buildings in the first place? Let's make a plan to get out of that. I need to see that plan. You know, and then I need to see, well, how do we fast track this plan? Because again, like when you talk about flying to almost space, because it's not even real space. Why are you going to almost space? Like, why are you literally spending money to go to almost space to come right back, and we're all sitting here in schools that have asbestos? I don't get it.
When the pandemic hit, as I mentioned, like in API community, always this is challenge for parents how to play a role to support their kids in the education system. So when the pandemic hit, it's definitely so miserable for especially APA immigrant parents to figure out what they should do, because like before, yes, they will see most of the time their kids spend the time in school, but now become most of the time they're all at school. So we organize like on social media and also community meeting to tell parents this is how you have to voice out without even starting from requesting the school to translate those discussion, the plan for COVID-19 or regulation, and to request the school to organize like the meeting to discuss with the parents with interpretation at the meeting to to allow them to voice out what they want the kids to be taken by the public school during the pandemic. Yeah, we're happy to see like more school district in PA, they translate their COVID-19 construction plan to Asian language, and also we have seen more and more meetings in public school for the parents. I mean, between the parents and the school, they offer the Asian language interpretation. And also, meanwhile, we think it's a long time wrong, which is a battle we have to fight for ourselves. So throughout like this past 1.5 years, we try to organize the API parents and to inspire them to see how important they need to involve with the school district, and even try to run for school board. And please join the parents and school association. We know so few Asian parents' faces are there. And on the top of all the challenges shared by all the students, the anti-Asian hate is so like typical and hit us so heavily during the pandemic. So it also brings up another layer of the concern, which is the safety. The parents start to worry about safety when their children return to school, and it happened even before the shutdown. Verbally, physically, violence happened to Asian kids already. And that is moment waking up many API parents that they have to say something. Yes, I'm so proud of them. Some of them went to the public school, went to school board to give the testimony to request a change. But some are satisfied with the outcome, some are not. So we're so happy to see this year. I think it's a year for the biggest number of APA parents who run for school board. And I'm so happy to hear the great news last week, multiple AAPI candidates went in their school board. And there's still some loss, but they will continue run for that. So we're very happy to see the change. And parents is a very important part of the education.
All right, so I know it's way beyond our time. Want to be really mindful of your generosity for being with us at that on a Wednesday night. So many thanks for joining us, and I feel like we talked about some very serious things, but I'm so glad that we did it together. And that gives me hope, knowing that you all are out there doing some really amazing work. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for all the work that you